Hey there! Welcome to the Distracted Librarians podcast. We're your friendly neighborhood bookworms with a penchant for all things pop culture.
Picture this as our digital campfire, where we dive into our latest obsessions, analyze our favorite distractions, and rediscover the joy of reading.
Whether you're a media enthusiast, a book lover, or just need a break from the daily grind, you've come to the right spot.
So kick back, relax, and get delightfully distracted with us. Hello! Today on the Distracted Librarians podcast, we are going to talk about memoirs. One of my favorite genres, near and dear to my heart. My name is Amanda.
I'm Killian.
And I'm Drew.
So, what is a memoir?
I had to look this up last night. Like, obviously, I've known the term for years and years, but the first thing that came up when I searched it is, what is the difference between a memoir and an autobiography? I had no idea. So apparently, I will run the Google search on this one. So a memoir and an autobiography are similar in that they are both the author talking about aspects of their own life. But autobiographies tend to be a lot more linear and fact-based, whereas memoirs will weave a narrative out of their life experiences and try and, glean meaning from individual bits of it.
Yeah, my favorite part about memoirs is because they are looking at their own memories and talking about parts of their life. I think it gives a medium for prose to really shine. Mm-hmm. So if an author is an amazing writer, they're going to really lean into that and really use their own life as a avenue to display their writing, or maybe vice versa. But I think that, to me, memoirs feel more literary, more interesting, more experimental than an autobiography. Mm-hmm.
That definition really helps explain why I do have memoirs that I've read. I don't have autobiographies that I've read.
Yeah.
I'm quickly realizing that as well.
Because, as interested as I am in history and in what people's lives are like, I'm much more interested in people's interpretations of their own lives than of just the facts and dates and things like that. It's history class looking at history immersively versus history class looking at a list of dates and people's names. And one is simply much more interesting to me than the other.
And it also gives them the chance to sort of cherry pick their own lives to find the through lines of the things that are relevant to them or relevant to them within this given topic. One of my favorites was Taste by Stanley Tucci. Why did I say Anthony? Hello. Taste by Stanley Tucci. And this is him retelling the events of his life, starting with childhood and through his whole acting career, through his relationship with food. And it's because when he was writing this, he had his oral cancer that he was dealing with and wasn't sure if he was going to be able to eat like a normal human or, enjoy food in the same way again. And it made him all nostalgic for all of the ways in which food has impacted his life his entire time, without really realizing that was one of the through lines of how his family showed love and how he found comfort. Really interesting. And tons of recipes throughout, which I have not tried one of. But I wrote down 3 of them. So
that's the first step.
We have hope for the future on this book that I read 3 years ago.
I sort of like Taste. I think that memoirs can give you a window into a specific subject. So in this case, food, but Italian food, right? I haven't read it yet.
Yes, Italian food.
I read a book called Strange Situation, A Mother's Journey into the Science of Attachment by Bethany Saltzman. It's one of those that's border memoir. It's in the 600s.
Oh.
But I really think it's a memoir because she uses her own life and her own concerns about her attachment to her parents and her mother, and then, well, what does it mean if I'm not well attached or have disorganized attachment to my parents, and what does that mean for my relationship to my daughter? Attachment being attachment theory in terms of how children bond with a primary caregiver. Mm-hmm. So what she ended up doing is highly researching Mary Ainsworth, which was a woman in, I believe, the 1950s, who was a pioneer on attachment theory and did these experiments, and she called them the strange situation, where she was in Africa, and I think she might have been in Africa because of her husband's work as well, but she had the opportunity to study women, mothers and children, and what happens when you put them in this strange situation, which is the case where you have a mother walk away. So it might just be not walking away for a long time. It's sort of reminiscent of school drop-off. Mm-hmm. It's like, does the kid start screaming? Do they start crying? Do they just like go and be by themselves? And what is the implication for the attachment to that primary caregiver, and how is that going to affect their ability to form bonds and feel safe within that relationship? Fascinating things. I think attachment is one of those things that is relatable to anyone.
Yes.
And so because right, we all were children and we all had a primary caregiver, and the way she presents it, though, through the lens of her own life, I think is really fascinating. And also her own worries about, like, am I bonded with my child properly? I'm sure a lot of parents worry about that. Highly recommend the book Strange Situation by Bethany Saltzman. And it's like the memoir was a carrier for research into attachment theory.
I tend to not be a big memoir reader. Well, yes, I read more memoirs than autobiographies. The memoirs, I'm, prepping for this episode, going through my Goodreads memoir shelf, and I'm like, there's so little on here, and so much of it is from a while ago. I tend to listen to audiobook versions of them. They tend to be the audiobook read by the person who wrote it.
I love that.
I did start listening to one because I was like, we're going to be doing this episode. So I'm in the middle of The Third Gilmore Girl by Kelly Bishop.
Oh, how is it?
It's so good.
Yes.
And that's the thing with this list is it's mostly celebrity memoirs. It's Kelly Bishop. It's Lauren Graham, Amy Poehler, Tina Fey. Mm-hmm. That's my list from the last decade of reading. And it's people who I'm interested in the things they've worked on. And so then I'm like, okay, tell me about your behind the scenes. And then you get more of their life because it's a memoir and they're talking about more than just that thing. So I'm just, like I said, partway through this one, and she talked about dancing in Las Vegas, and now talking about making the shift from being a chorus dancer on Broadway to auditioning for principal roles in shows. And just giving that little bit of insight into a world that I'm very much not in, never have been. Love the product. I will go see a Broadway show if I'm ever actually in New York. But like I see shows here all the time, and seeing just what that process is like, what that world is like, since I'm not going to ever actually be in it, has been really fun. And having it, because I so thoroughly will attach people to characters, I've seen Kelly Bishop in more than one thing, more than just Gilmore Girls. She's still Emily Gilmore, which I think she acknowledges with the title.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like, I'm sitting down with Emily Gilmore and hearing the story of this fabulous life that has nothing to do with Gilmore Girls yet, but it's still Emily Gilmore telling me this. And that's a lot of fun for me.
Well, one of my recent fixations, as was yours, is Wicked.
Yep.
So the most recent memoir that I read was Viewfinder by John M. Chu. And very little of it had to do with Wicked. It was more about his Silicon Valley upbringing and then his entrance into the film world. He was under the wing of Steven Spielberg for a bit. And then, as technology advances and his childhood world collides with all of the ways technology intermingles itself into the film industry and Hollywood in general, the ways in which that's affected his view of both.
Can I ask a dumb question?
Yeah.
Who's John M. Chu?
He was the director of the Wicked movie. He also directed Crazy Rich Asians.
Okay, cool.
Which is also a favorite movie of yours.
Which is also a favorite movie of mine. Crazy Rich Asians is on the list of movies I've seen so many times they work well as background noise when I read.
When we lived together, I would just walk in, and that was one of the movies that would be on the TV every once in a while. It's like, okay.
Drew's in the mood again.
So are there any classic memoirs that you think are of note from history or from a standpoint that is a must-read?
I think there are always going to be those, The Glass Castle is one that, I always remember really liking in high school. I did not like much required reading in high school. Mm-hmm. And Glass Castle is one that I remember breaking through for me really well. Unfortunately, I don't remember, much of what was in it at this point in my life, but
that's okay. Put you on a path to love literature. It's all right.
Exactly. And it gives me things to reread once I decide to go that route.
So it's my turn to ask a stupid question. What are classic memoirs? I don't.
Sure. Yeah.
I'm unfamiliar with what memoirs would be classics.
I think of it as something that had, maybe older, maybe not, but had historical significance. Mm-hmm. So, Night by Elie Wiesel comes to mind. Showed a firsthand experience of concentration camps during World War II. The other one that, again, I think was required reading, but I remember loving it and sort of really, for once, loving my assigned reading was Things We Carried by Tim O'Brien, which talked about the Vietnam War. Mm-hmm. Also super important because looking back at those times, there wasn't this very direct and instantaneous reporting of wars. So to read a memoir after the fact was, there was more instantaneous with the Vietnam War because of TV being so prevalent, but to be able to see the firsthand experience of that person and what was sort of actually going on the ground is super important. I
may have fully forgotten that Night existed because I'm sitting here going, I don't think I read memoirs in any of my English classes. I really can't think of any. And then you said that, I'm like, no, we read that in my 9th grade English class. Yeah. But I also try to block that English class out because it is the one English class that I truly despised for not related to Night, fully related to other things. But it was not a good experience.
I'm sorry.
But I was like, oh yeah, I did read that. That is a thing.
Another one that I tend to think of as a classic is Into Thin Air by John Krakauer. He was a climber who climbed Mount Everest in the mid-90s in a really, really violent season in terms of the weather and just conditions that existed there, and talked about his individual climb in the midst of talking about the history and everything else that happened within that small set of years.
This is not historically significant, but being a phenomenon, Eat, Pray, Love.
Honestly.
I was not a librarian at the time, but I remember being at work and having a customer tell me I needed to read this book. And I was like, okay. And I read it and I loved it. And I was probably 21 at the time, and the customer was probably in her 40s. And we both had this loved this same book, which I think is a really nice way to connect with someone. But that was, I mean, definitely a phenomenon. I feel like it was
everywhere.
It was everywhere. It was on library bookshelves. It was then in every bookstore. And then also, as being someone who has spent many hours thrifting, that book was always at the thrift store on a book you could buy for 25 cents. And of course made into a movie, et cetera, et cetera.
I've seen many copies of it go through like library book sales and things like that too.
And it's also something that's just been so riffed on and memeified since that you're never going to be able to deny its cultural impact.
I don't think my brain ever connected it as a memoir.
Yeah?
Yeah. And like, I'm sitting here going, obviously it is. But I don't, that just clicked.
Also from the memoir standpoint, that generally someone's writing a memoir to tell you how they overcame a struggle or how they grew in their life. And I think Eat, Pray, Love does that with in a really interesting way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of my favorite memoirs, just because of how well he can make me laugh, is David Sedaris.
Oh, yeah.
The man is hysterical. And then, weirdly, Calypso was the first one of his that I read, which is much more of a serious topic, and talking about his family and his upbringing and his relationship to his family. But the man is hysterical. And that's what gets me through his books.
Did you read it or listen to the audiobook?
Read it.
Okay. Because he's such a great teller of his own stories that the audiobook's perfect medium for him.
I'm still missing, I think, 2 of his. So I will take you up on that.
Yeah.
Because that feels correct.
And I think I'm trying to think, like, have I ever sat down and tried to read a physical copy of a memoir? And I don't, not any of the more current ones. There's a few kids ones. El Defo is a graphic novel memoir. The Promise of Change is actually a memoir that's in verse from one of the girls who was one of the Clinton 12 in one of the first schools to integrate in the U.S.
Oh, wow.
And those I've read in print, but all of the adult memoirs that I have read have been, like I said earlier, audiobooks read by the author. And I think part of it for me is being able to connect that actual voice, because they're reading it how they intended it to be. Whereas like when you read print, you can read it different ways. And I like knowing what they intended, particularly in something so personal.
Now, as librarians, have either of you put on a program or attended a program of an author who wrote a memoir and came to speak about it?
No. I have. Yeah. We had last year at Bloomfield Township.
Curtis Chin, I think.
Curtis Chin, thank you so much. Everything I learned in a Chinese restaurant. And his memoir is about growing up in Detroit and having his family own a Chinese restaurant where he often worked at. And he talks about his experience as being a Chinese person in an area where experiencing quite a bit of racism, and how his experience was on the outside because of having that sense of discrimination, but also having his whole life centered around this Chinese restaurant is maybe not typical, but also delicious. And it was a very funny book. And he was a great presenter as well.
Yeah. I remember I attended a virtual author talk for Crying in H Mart.
Oh, nice.
By Michelle Zahner. And that was another book that I'd read for my book club. Almost every memoir that I've read has been for the book club. I sort of take advantage of the general interest of the group and slot a memoir in every year just to keep myself versed on them. But Michelle Zahner, who is also the lead performer in Japanese Breakfast, was a really interesting speaker about her book and the limitations that she put on herself within it to really only focus on her relationship with her mother. I think in the book, her father doesn't even get a name because he's not relevant to the story being told. And that was a really interesting thing to hear her talk about, is why she gave herself such a narrow scope for writing this book, in which she's not really an author like that, where it's not, her chosen profession, and, the decisions that she made on it were so individual to her. It was really interesting to hear her talk about it.
That's cool. I'm sure that in the scope of a life, how do you narrow it down to these like specific moments? So I'm sure it's almost helpful to like hone it in to have those parameters.
I also, listening, will get stuck on like, how do you remember this thing from so many years ago in detail? So is this the actual detail, or are you taking the general theme of an experience that you had and maybe giving it a little creative liberty to make the point you're trying to make with it?
I'm sure there is a lot of taking liberty with following your own memory and possibly embellishment, because you have to have specific detail. You have to have dialogue. Is that exactly what that person said? Probably not.
It's the concept.
Will that be hard to confront the people in your life when they read it and they're like, I didn't say that? I don't know.
Things to think about if we ever write our own memoirs.
Do you clear it with your family members?
Depends on the tone of the memoir.
Truly.
Are there any examples of really unconventional memoirs that you've read that you liked?
I think just the two that I mentioned earlier, El Duffo by Cece Bell, being that graphic novel format. And we see that a lot with youth memoirs that will come. Either it's a graphic novel memoir or it is fictionalized. It's marketed as fiction, but it's very much like the character's the author's name. It is very much built around their experience. We see that with some of the Raina Telgemeier books. And
is that American Born
like
Chinese
that.
too?
I'm not sure,
Okay.
honestly. It's been so long since I've read that one.
Yeah.
But, and then The Promise of Change by Joanne Allen Boyce is that novel in verse, or memoir in verse. And I love a novel in verse. They read so quickly, and I think you can communicate. I'm sure it's hard to craft it, but I think you can communicate so well in that format. And so to take the experience of being a child going through the process of integration of a school in 1956, one of the earliest schools, if not the earliest school, to integrate, and now years later putting that experience down in poetry, it makes prose feel almost fluffy with how emotional that poetry is, because it's just pared down to the necessity.
And what age group is that for?
It's middle grade, so that's probably going to be your late elementary into middle school.
I want to read it.
It was so good.
Yeah.
I don't remember exact details. It's been years, but I was scrolling that shelf on Goodreads, and I'm like, oh yeah, I remember reading this. I remember sitting there and like having an emotional reaction to reading this. And I hadn't thought about it in a few years, but it came back.
Cool.
Honestly, I'm only realizing that the answer to your question is no. I really haven't. Looking at the list of ones that I'm aware of, most of the ones that I've read were either for school or for my book club that do focus on, the written word, making it as literary as possible, that I really haven't explored, memoirs and personal stories through other formats in ways that I have explored that with, fiction and tropes of things that I've been interested there.
Well, one I have thought of, and I've wanted to plug this book for a while. I don't think the library actually even owns it. We might need to change that. It's called Nina Simone's Gum. and that's Gum is in at G-U-M.
Okay.
By Warren Ellis. Warren Ellis is a musician. I discovered him through the group Dirty Three. He's a violinist, but he's also in The Bad Seeds, as in Nick Cave in The Bad Seeds. Mm-hmm. So he is talking about this specific experience. He was at a show where he was playing, but also like Nina Simone was playing. And she is about to start her set, and she takes gum out of her mouth and sticks it on the grand piano. And after her set, he's like, I have to have that gum. And he takes
As
it.
one does.
And he's like, this is my idol. I need her gum chewed. And so he takes a piece of gum and saves it for like years, and then discovers it in like a box somewhere later on. And he's like, I have to preserve this. So it talks about so many things. Nina Simone, it talks about his life as a musician. It talks about the need to archive certain moments and document certain moments. In this case, her life and, I don't know, her teeth marks. And he talks about the artistic process. He works with a jewelry maker to make a mold of this gum.
Oh my God.
And this whole thing. And then it's like the artistic process of how do we put this out in the world and display it to the world, because I can't just enjoy it. It is for everyone. Artifacts of Nina Simone are for everyone. It is one of the most inventive, interesting. I mean, there's photos, there's talks about artistic process. Highly recommend Nina Simone's Gum. If you like Nina Simone, if you like Warren Ellis, if you just like quirkiness, if you like idolizing a musician and wanting to have a piece of them with you. That was one of my favorites for sure. One of the best books I've read in several years.
I will say, did either of you grow up watching Hey Arnold?
No.
I went straight to the shrine that Helga Pataki has of Arnold in her closet.
Isn't part of it made of his used chewing gum?
Sure is.
Great.
Sure is.
Well, I think that covers Memoirs.
Sure. We've barely scratched the surface on it.
And we end on Hey Arnold.
That sounds perfect.
Amazing.
All right. Well, thanks for discussing with me, guys.
Yeah. Let us know what your favorite memoirs are. What if we missed? What do we need to read? Clearly, I need recommendations.
Please add to our list.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Distracted Librarians.
Many thanks to BCTV for their support in recording, editing, and releasing this podcast, and to the Friends of the Library for sponsoring closed captioning on every episode.
If you have any questions or suggestions, feel free to reach out to us at distracted@btpl.org.
Until then, keep those pages turning and those screens lighting up. We'll catch you in the next episode.
The views and opinions expressed in the Distracted Librarians podcast do not necessarily reflect those of Bloomfield Township Public Library, Bloomfield Community Television, the Birmingham Area Cable Board, or its producers or production staff.